My name is Lynn Ray Blizzard, and I would like to share a family story with you. These are my parents, Thomas and Sonia Rutherford. They were married in November of 1966. My parents grew up basically next door to each other in western North Carolina, in the town of Candler, in a place called the Big Cove. It's about 30 minutes outside of Asheville, which is home to the world-famous Biltmore Estate. I've been there many times in my life. The last time was in 2008 when I took these photos. You can see some of the magnificent architecture, and I highly recommend visiting this estate if you ever get the chance to go to Asheville. It was built by some of the Vanderbilts. This is a picture of my father and my three uncles. My father is all the way on the right, Tommy Ray, and all the way on the left is my mother's brother, Jim. The two fellows in the middle, on the left is Terry, and on the right is John. So all four of these fellows grew up together, and here they are in New Year's Eve of 1957, drinking some moonshine together. This is a picture of the property around my grandmother's house. As you can see, it's very beautiful land, and I'm sharing mainly about my mother's family today, focusing on my great-grandmother, Bonnie Etta Jackson Mason, but I knew her as Granny Bonnie. This is my great-great-grandmother, Laura Trull Jackson, and she's holding her two daughters, Bonnie and Lula. Bonnie was born in July of 1893. As you can see, she and her sister Lula are very close in age. I don't know a lot about her mother, my great-great-grandmother Laura, but this note was a note that she sent to a friend. And Candler is a small town, and people stay there, live there for many generations. Everybody knows everybody else, and everybody's pretty much related to everybody else in one way or another. And someone came across this note in some of their old papers and passed it back to one of my family members. So that's how we ended up back with this note that my great-great-grandmother had written to a friend. It's a poem dated from Hominy Creek, May 16, 1886. Dear friend, whatever we choose, we may faint the feelings refined as ill. The thoughts of the hero or saints, a sculptor of self we may be, chiseled as Phidias wrought, carve on the face what all may see, a soul by the master taught. Your friend, Laura J. This is another photo of Granny Bonnie with my great-great-grandmother, Laura. This is likely one of the last pictures taken before Granny Bonnie's father died. My great-great-grandmother, Laura, was left alone with 5 children: Bonnie, Lula, Richard, Oscar, and Ernest. She had another daughter, Aura, who had died. My great-great-grandmother, Laura, was obviously in a difficult situation, being a widow with 5 children. And apparently her father was concerned that he would have to support her and the children, because he came to her home not long after her husband died, and he rounded up all the children, literally tearing her baby Ernest out of her arms. He took them away and he scattered them to different places. My grandmother, Bonnie, and her sister Lula were sent to a place called the Asheville Normal School. They worked there as maids, and they received an education from the older students. So even though this was a terrible, terrible tragedy that happened to them, they did most likely get a much better education than they would have gotten otherwise. My great-uncle Richard was given to a shopkeeper, basically as a slave, and different families took in Oscar and Ernest. This is my Granny Bonnie with her husband, Lude Mason. Bonnie and Lula, after they left the normal school, they went to Washington State. No one can seem to remember why, what motivated them to go to Washington State. But Lula married out there, and Granny Bonnie married out there. She married Lude Mason. Now, they had actually met as children back in Candler, but they met up there, and they married out there. They stayed there until my Grandma Cindy, pictured here with my Aunt Odie, they stayed here until my Grandma Cindy was about 9 years old. So Grandma Cindy is my mother's mother. She's my grandma. When she was about 9, they decided to come back, and they camped across country to return to Candler. This is a picture of my Grandma Cindy and my Grandpa Lawrence, my Aunt Odie, my Uncle Jim, and my Uncle John. Grandma Cindy is pregnant with my mother in this picture, so this is in 1944. This is Granny Bonnie holding my mother, her grandchild. So this was in 1945. My mother, Sonia, was named after the Olympic gold medalist Sonia Henne. Granny Bonnie grieved that her brothers were gone, and she never stopped looking for them. She began writing letters and searching for information about them. She even placed ads in newspapers, and amazingly, eventually, she found all of them. From the left, that's my great Uncle Richard with my cousin Winnell, Granny Bonnie in the middle, and her brother Ernest. I don't have a picture of Oscar, but she did find him as well. This is my great Uncle Richard. I remember him very well. He was a very, very sweet, kind man. Here he is visiting us in Reston, Virginia, where we lived when I was a child. I'm the monkey with the big ears, the baby, and that's my sister Lee on the right. My mother said that Uncle Richard would frequently say that when he died, he hoped to go to hell so that he could watch his grandfather burn, speaking of the man who had torn his family apart rather than helping them survive together. This is a very sharp contrast to the man that I remember, because he was so sweet. But I've heard my mother say this on more than one occasion, so I'm sure that it's true. The shopkeeper that Uncle Richard was given to when he was a child, of like maybe 9 or 10 years old, was very, very cruel to him, and he beat him. And he ran away several times. When he was about 12 years old, he ran away for good, and he was on his own since that time. He started working for the railroad, and then he began working for the phone company, and he had a long career with them. It's really amazing to me to think about how he struck out on his own at 12 years old, and what an interesting person that he was, and that he still was so kind and loving, even though he'd had such a hard life. He visited us and extended family members for up until he died. And this is a picture of my Granny Bonnie and Daddy Lude. That's what he was called, Daddy Lude. Their relationship was somewhat contentious. When he was a younger man, he was a very heavy drinker, and even after marriage and fatherhood. And he'd frequently be gone for very long periods of time working as a logger, but he sent very little money home. My mother speculates that he drank up most of his profit. Granny Bonnie supported her children almost single-handedly as a sharecropper. And her oldest daughter, my Grandma Cindy, took care of the children while she worked all day. But these are stories that my mother was eventually told. As a child, she remembers him as Daddy Lude and a very sweet grandpa. He had quit drinking by then, and everyone says that he was a very loving grandfather, and then the grandchildren's memories of him are very pleasant. And this is another picture of my Granny Bonnie with my mother's first cousins, Winnell and Arisa. This is how I remember her. She was always doing something with her hands. Here she was peeling potatoes. Normally she was crocheting, knitting. She was always dipping snuff. By the time I knew her, she was very, very sweet, but my mother's description of her is that she was all business, probably because she had to work so very hard when she was a young woman. This photo was taken at the beach, and the afternoon sun cast a shadow, but everyone in the family who knew him agrees that it does not seem to be Granny Bonnie's shadow, but it looks like Daddy Lude's shadow, despite the fact that this photo was taken a good 10 years after he died. This is one of the last pictures taken of her while she was still living at home. Granny Bonnie died in 1990 when I was 17 years old, but by the time I was in my teens, she was struggling with dementia, and she spent her last few years in a nursing home. My mother says that Granny Bonnie always loved babies, and even as an older woman, she took care of children to earn money. And she says that Granny frequently said, "Most people in my generation lost a child, and I never lost a child." She was very grateful for that. Her life was very difficult, but her tenacity carried her through her difficulties, and she seemed to enjoy her old age before she became ill.